Hello again. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the New Character Matters. This is the program where we talk about all things pertaining to character and character disturbances. And over the past couple of programs, we've been talking about what I term in my upcoming book on the subject, the second commandment of character, which has to do with overcoming any sense of entitlement and developing a profound sense of gratitude and the resulting obligations that come from feeling indebted, inherently indebted for the many gifts that we have that are, in fact, unearned. Now, today I'd like to focus just a little bit more on some of the impediments that there are, especially in our day and time, to feeling grateful. And the reason I'd like to spend some time on it is because the research on gratitude conducted by several researchers at the University of California at Berkeley and others in conjunction with the lead investigator, Robert Emmons, who has written several books on the topic. The research is very clear. Gratitude, it turns out, is really good for you and in many different ways. So I'd like to talk about that a bit more today. These days, in our culture of entitlement, it's very hard to develop any feelings of gratitude. But the research is very clear. Gratitude is good for you. And as the rhyming little phrase suggests, gratitude is purely a matter of attitude. You don't have to just make a laundry list, even in your mind, of all the things that we enjoy that you can feel grateful about. Gratitude is more a pervasive attitude of how to approach life and the gift that it is, the totally unearned gift that it is. And in my upcoming book, as the second commandment, as it were, reads, the fact is that we are entitled to nothing, that this very existence of ours is a totally unearned gift. Now, there are a lot of impediments to feeling grateful for it, not the least of which is the fact that we human beings come into this world and exist through much of our lives solidly aligned with what Freud called the pleasure principle. And that is simply this: from the minute we start breathing, from the very minute we start breathing, we bring with us a certain fear of existence. This is a cold, hostile, potentially cruel place. And until we get our first taste of some relief, comfort, pleasure, we're scared of the whole experience. This is every human being's experienced from our earliest hours of birth. We come from a safe place, generally speaking. Some of us are not so fortunate. Some of us who may have been in utero subjected to various types of trauma because of what our carriers experienced or did to themselves, may not have had such a wonderful experience in utero. But we come, generally speaking, from a comfortable place and are thrust into a world that's cold, cruel, potentially dangerous, and we don't like it. As a matter of fact, most of us start crying the minute we get here if we're not slapped a little bit to get us going and to help clear out our lungs. And we don't really calm down until we're comforted, until we get our first taste of pleasure. And so long as life is on balance, generally pleasurable, we want to live. When life gets too painful, when life becomes devoid of joy, when we've lost the ability to experience pleasure. In psychology speak, we call that anhedonia. When that happens, most of us actually would rather not be here. We are solidly, as human beings, aligned with the pleasure principle for most of our lives. Now, hopefully, at some point in our character development, in our emotional development, in our psychological development, and especially in our spiritual development, hopefully at some point, we come to appreciate and have reverence for this marvelous gift and embrace it for what it is, pain and all. But for most of us, especially in these character disturbed times of ours, in these times of massive entitlement, where almost everything once regarded as a privilege or something to be earned is regarded these days as a right simply because we're breathing. It's hard to find any sense of gratitude. It's hard to feel grateful. And in our alignment with the pleasure principle, we will basically abandon our zest for life unless we get enough of the things that we consider will make us happy, or that we believe will make us happy, or please us, or bring us some comfort. Now, mature characters have transcended the pleasure principle, but mature characters are rare in our days of more widespread character disturbance. And our culture of entitlement has a lot to do with that. That's one of the factors, just one of the factors, that makes it hard for folks to find room in their hearts for gratitude. But there's another, and that's the perception of being cheated or denied some things. Whether that perception has any objective validity or not. Some individuals, through no fault of their own, are born into circumstances that are truly depraved, and they are deprived as a result of many of the things that most of us come to expect in the way of creature and material comforts. And it's very understandable that folks raised in those kinds of environments or who experience deprivation of some sort, abuse, neglect, unsafe environments, trauma. It's understandable that folks who experience these things would necessarily have a fairly negative view toward life itself and be therefore so determined to secure whatever pleasures they can, even if they're only momentary, and even if they're ultimately self-destructive, because they just simply don't know that life can be any better. They've come to expect unfair treatment from the world, from their caretakers. They've come to expect hardship. And they become jaded in their outlook. I said just a moment ago that gratitude is a matter of attitude. Well, it's hard to cultivate such an attitude when you're steeped in an atmosphere of danger, abuse, neglect, deprivation, et cetera, et cetera. And the other major impediment to feeling grateful for cultivating a proper attitude toward the many gifts that we have is overindulgence. We can come to expect too much. We can be given too much merely for breathing. We can be spoiled. We live in an age of plenty, and we also sometimes come into an atmosphere of indulgence and appeasement. We can come to expect so much, in fact, that we get too easily down in the dumps and too unhappy and too displeased with life when we don't get more. We have such high expectation that the slightest disappointment or the slightest bit of denial throws us into a tizzy. So it's not just deprivation that can cause us to have difficulty feeling grateful. It's overindulgence too. And this is the age, after all, of both entitlement and indulgence. And it takes its toll. So that's another factor that in our day and time contributes to the fact that some people have a really hard time moving past this unhealthy, strict adherence to the pleasure principle. It's also at the root of so many of our addictive diseases. So many folks try to fill the holes within them, the deep emotional voids that they experience, the deep loss of appreciation for life itself. So many folks try to fill that void with short-term hedonistic pursuits. So sometimes that addiction may be a sexual addiction, maybe a porn addiction, maybe an addiction to drugs or alcohol, anything to fill the emotional hole that's there as people stay allied with the principle that we call the pleasure principle. It takes a lot of maturity of character to move beyond living life strictly on the pleasure principle. It takes a lot of character maturity to find room in your heart for gratitude, even among the slings and arrows of life that are inevitable. It takes a lot to find room for gratitude, even when you're dealing with pain and hardship. But the research is clear. No addictive behavior, no matter how pleasurable it seems at the moment, no matter how much it seems to uh, bring comfort in the moment for a while, none of those things are lasting, and they all result in a death worse than physical death. They result in spiritual death. For life just is barely existence when one is chasing after the next high and is miserable in between. That's not really living. And the research is clear. Life doesn't have to be a picnic for us to feel grateful. We've actually looked at this very methodically. One would think that a comfortable life or a life that has many joyous opportunities in it would naturally lead people to find it easier to have gratitude in their hearts, that we would more easily be grateful. But the research actually indicates the opposite, because sometimes folks just never have enough. And when they get used to, in this age of entitlement, having a lot, they always want more. That emotional void, that hole inside is still there, looking to be filled. And that's not existing. Rather, the research suggests, and my experience has taught me this too, in working with so many people over the years, when we make space to feel grateful for even the few little things that we do have, and when we find space in the heart to feel grateful for this magnificent gift of existence, even though it carries with it inevitable times of pain and hardship, when we make room for that in our hearts, life gets better, it gets richer. And the more grateful we are, the more space opens up in the heart. So gratitude really requires practice like any other positive behavior. And we know the link between our ways of thinking, our feeling states, our attitudes. We know the link between those things and our behavior. When we have the proper attitudes, when we have the proper feeling states, when we have the proper thinking patterns, our behavior falls into line. So when those feeling states and attitudes and thinking patterns are positive, positive behaviors result. But it works the other way too. When we exercise positive behaviors, even when it's tough, even when we don't want to, even when our heart's not really in it because we've been undergoing a rough patch, when we exercise gratitude, when we practice it, our attitude changes, our thinking patterns change, our feelings actually change. And as I've said many, many times in many workshops, repeating a famous axiom that I did not invent, but I think is worth repeating over and over again. It is a lot more powerful, effective, and it's actually a lot easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting. And this is probably the biggest mistake that most therapists make when they're working with individuals experiencing all kinds of problems. Most therapists spend a whole lot of time and energy trying to get people to look at things differently, trying to get folks to think differently, hoping that in looking at things differently and in thinking about things differently, regarding things differently, behavior will change. But it really works better the opposite way. It behooves any therapist wanting to provide any meaningful help to encourage people and to reinforce people for doing things differently. Because if you do the same old things, you're going to get the same old results. And if you begin to act more gratefully, if you begin to act more reverently toward this miraculous gift, even in the midst of maybe pain and hardship, you would be surprised at what changes in your heart. Now, I know some people might tend to trivialize what I'm saying, but those who know me and know my work, and hopefully have done their own assessment of my character, know that I am not just speaking from experience, a wealth of experience, but from what I know to be true in the deepest recesses of my soul. So I hope that you take this commandment that I've been talking about seriously. And I hope you appreciate that even though sages throughout the ages have carried this message, the empirical research is solidly supporting it too. It is good for you, not just to count your blessings. That's good for you too, even in the midst of pain and hardship. But it's also good for you to act gratefully, to tackle each day like it represents another opportunity to grow, to experience real life. And we cannot do that when we stay so aligned with the pleasure principle that every time we face pain and hardship, we get down in the dumps, morose, or maybe even bitter. And next time, I want to talk more specifically about bitterness because I know so many folks who have succumbed to a syndrome that we'll talk about next time, whereby they hang on to their bitterness. So I want to talk next time more about bitterness and how it develops and how people can sometimes uh, actually revel in their bitterness, hold on to it, uh, and we'll explain why that happens. But I think that our hedonistic culture, our pleasure-oriented, entitled culture, has a lot to do with how many bitter people that I have met. Anybody can make a case, anyone can make a case that their life has not been the bed of roses that they hoped it would be. But we're not promised a bed of roses. Life is just that. It's life. And it comes necessarily with slings and arrows. This world, as we well know, is not heaven, not by any stretch, but it is an incredible opportunity to grow emotionally, psychologically, and especially spiritually, and to find meaning, and to not just be pleased, but to find genuine joy, peace of heart, real contentment, fulfillment. But to do that, we have to grow past living purely on the pleasure principle. Sadly, in our times, that's a very difficult task for too many people. And it happens in one of two ways primarily. Like I mentioned before, it can happen because an individual is born in some kind of uh, deprivation. They experience too much deprivation, or at least perceived deprivation, or maybe even abuse or neglect or other forms of trauma. So they come to this enterprise we call life starving, hungry. And because they lack the skills to procure more sophisticated forms of comfort, they turn to all kinds of behaviors that give them momentary pleasure that eventually become addictions, but never can fill the hole. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, the other major way is overindulgence, coming to expect too much, coming to expect that we don't have to face difficulty, that we should be spared the trials of life, that everything should be handed to us. We shouldn't have to work too hard, that it shouldn't be such a struggle. Uh, and we get too easily disappointed when we have to put ourselves out or sacrifice. And it's hard to feel grateful when we think we actually have to suffer a little bit. Some suffering is actually good for us, but where we indulge too much and we grow up in too much of a culture of entitlement, we have a hard time appreciating that. No amount of temporary, pleasurable things in our lives can really bring us what our heart craves more than anything else. We're always going to end up hungry. And that's the reason. And I've spent so much time in the rewrite of this book that was first tentatively titled The 10 Commandments of Character. I didn't want it to be just a handbook for all those behaviors that you have to do to be a decent person, to be a person of good character. Rather, I wanted it to be real food for the soul. Not chicken soup, so to speak, but real time-tested behavioral axioms for putting the real joy in life, for having a life that truly feels worth living, that has purpose, direction, and brings inner peace. There are some time-tested principles that can help us move beyond living life merely on the pleasure principle, where we're always looking for something to appease us, something to fill the hole. So with that in mind, I urge you to tune in to the next edition of the new Character Matters. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll be talking a lot more on bitterness, how it develops, and how this commandment that is all about gratitude can help us overcome the tendency toward bitterness and bring back some of the joy in life. So once again, thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. George Simon. I'll see you next time on the next edition of the new Character Matters. Take care.